Okay, so memorable collaborations. I think probably the most memorable and possibly one of the kind of most long-term collaborations that I was involved with, and actually this wasn't very digital in its nature, was the work that I did with historic royal palaces. And that was in collaboration with Joanne Sainer, who is at Newcastle University now. And it was also in collaboration with Imperial War Museums obviously historic royal palaces as well, and in particular the Tower of London. So we had started a kind of collaborative project. I think this must have been in about 2010 or 2011, which was all about exploring kind of challenging histories. And we'd set up a network and we would get lots of people together to talk about, how can we work more responsibly, sensitively, carefully when it comes to the interpretation of challenging heritages. And the Tower of London were one of the partners on that work. And we would all get together and we would talk about, various different kinds of projects, various different kinds of challenges. And then one day, our contact at the Tower of London came in and said, oh my goodness, they're going to put, 800,000 or whatever it was, poppies in the moat at the Tower of London. And we were all like, oh, wow, okay, that's kind of, quite a stunning idea. And of course, then that became this incredibly infamous kind of project to commemorate the centenary of World War One, where they put the poppies in the moat at the Tower of London. So around the edges of the installation, the Tower were really keen to encourage people to engage kind of reflectively and maybe even critically with what they were doing with those poppies in the moat. And so we worked with them to come up with a kind of learning programme that sat alongside the poppies installation, which was called Why Remember. And which they used to do all sorts of different kinds of work. So they did work with schools, they did work with performers, they did a TV programme, I think, for the Discovery Channel as well. So, all sorts of different kinds of mechanisms for engaging people with this Why Remember programme. And the Why Remember programme was asking people to reflect on, why we commemorate, why we remember, why it's important to remember, and how we should go about remembering. And, in the kind of context of this kind of, installation that was in the Tower moat, those became quite kind of, powerful prompts for people to reflect. So we spoke with something like, I think it was 1,800 people or something in London who had turned, and there were millions of people who turned up, I'm sure you remember, to see those poppies, and politicians were standing in front of them and, giving their spiel and all the rest of it. So we spoke with, something like 1,800 people and asked them about their interactions with that installation and to reflect on remembrance. And we wrote a paper about that, which you can find and have a look at. But we also then took our kind of questions and our research on tour with the poppies, because you may remember, it feels like ancient history, some of this, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Two bits of the poppies installation went on tour all around the country. So there were two installations, and there was the Wave and Weeping Window that went all around the UK to be installed in different kinds of heritage contexts. And I think there were 17 installations of those. And so that, and over the course of the centenary, so I think it was over the 5-year period of the centenary. And we went on tour with our questions, and we spoke to, I think it was again another couple of thousand people, and asked them to reflect on remembrance. And then that work helped to inform then another piece of work that happened at the Tower, kind of to mark the end of the centenary, which I'm going to struggle to remember the name of. It will come back to me. Okay. Which was a different kind of provocation that they put in the moat to mark the end of the centenary. And again, we were there with our questions. So that was a kind of, a long and very involved collaboration, which was, hugely rewarding, lots and lots of partners. And yeah, just, it was a real privilege to have those conversations with people in very different kinds of contexts. And, talking to people about the poppy in Northern Ireland, it's a very different kind of a conversation that you're having than if you talk to them in, Hay on Wye or in Orkney or, whatever. So it was an incredible data set that we amassed from that collaboration. Yeah. So that was, a big old project.
And what kind of responses did you have from people in relation to the artwork?
A lot of what we got from people was quite kind of practiced ways of talking about remembrance and talking about war. Often a lack of criticality, actually, which was interesting. Some people would be critical, and especially in some contexts they would be critical. Again, Northern Ireland being the most notable example of that. And I think actually older people were maybe more critical in their reflections on kind of remembrance and our kind of broader practices of remembrance, not just the Poppies installation itself. What we actually found when we talked to younger people was more of that kind of quite practiced, quite sedimented way of talking about remembrance. Lest we forget, we must remember. A lot of those kind of tropes about, remembrance and about World War One, perhaps especially, kind of coming through in the responses, and a kind of a bit of a sense that people were not engaging with it maybe as critically as we might have hoped that they would, and all of that then kind of informed then the way that they marked the end of the centenary with this last installation in the moat, which was I would say more provocative and encouraged people to engage, I think, more critically.
And when you undertake this kind of research, how do you structure that research in terms of questions and getting people to, I suppose, answer openly? And I understand you can't always do that, but how do you go about framing those questions, and in what settings do you ask those questions? Does that vary, or is it the same, or do you have a kind of general way that you do it as a researcher?
So I would say, kind of looking across the research that I've done, I'm a big fan of multiple methods in studies, and so actually you could say that the Tower study, is very much kind of survey based, or these kind of questions that we were asking people, they were, it wasn't like we were doing interviews as such. They were quite kind of short questions, short responses from people in a kind of survey style. And that was quite unusual for me. I'm much more used to working with kind of multiple methods. So I like using surveys, but really I would say I'm a kind of interview and focus group kind of a person, and using wherever possible kind of creative methodologies. So I think different projects lend themselves to different kinds of methods, and there are restrictions, limitations. I mean, you can't stop people in front at the Tower of London and ask them to give you 30 minutes of their time to sit down and have a full interview with you. Well, you could, but you maybe wouldn't get very far when you're largely dealing with tourists who are kind of rushing about the place. So you have to take different kinds of methods for different kinds of projects. I like it where I'm able to use, interviews or focus groups, and then kind of combine them with other kinds of methodologies. As I say, kind of more creative or arts-based approaches. One of the things that we did with the Performance Learning and Heritage projects at Manchester University was use lots of creative methods. And some of that research was working with kids as well, so school kids who were coming along to the museums, and we would go into the schools and we would do mind mapping exercises with them, or we would get them to act out things that they had seen, or to draw pictures in response to it, or make a cartoon, or whatever it might be. And I really enjoyed that approach. And actually in that project, another thing we were able to do, which we really struggle to do in a lot of digital heritage work, was a kind of longitudinal study. So kind of, looking over time at what the impacts of those practices were on people. So we would interview people on, or do a focus group with them, whichever approach was best for the museum we were working with. We would talk to them on the day, so they would watch a performance, then they would come and do an interview with us, and we would give them 20 quid for speaking to us. And so we would talk with them for 20 or 30 minutes, and then they would go off and finish their museum visit, and then we would phone them a week or two later and have another conversation with them. And then we would phone them again about 9 or 10 months later and have another conversation with them. So just to get that sense over time of how that visit and that performance, that interaction kind of was being kind of sedimented into their memories of the visit and what they might have taken away from it. Now, of course, the fact that we were having conversations with them also changed maybe what they were going to kind of remember, or that kind of legacy of the visit for them. But it's really rare to get that kind of, opportunity to do that, longer term study. So that was really nice, and another kind of methodology that we were able to bring to that project. And we've used some really nice creative methods around the work that we've been doing as well. So and the new project, which maybe I'll say more about in a bit, is going to use another kind of set of methods again. So I like to try new methods and think about interesting ways of kind of combining them with maybe more traditional approaches. I've also done quite quantitative kind of a lot of what I've said there is very kind of qualitative, rich, deep kind of research that takes time and resources to do. But we've also done a fair bit of kind of quantitative stuff as well, looking at social media data, or doing kind of analyses of policy documents using kind of, online kind of digital humanities kind of, approaches. So I'm not averse to doing the quantitative stuff as well. It just depends what the project kind of demands.
Mm. And with the qualitative data, where do you start with that in terms of understanding? Because I can imagine you'd have volumes and volumes of content and data sets from that. How do you start by mapping that?
You can begin to map things quantitatively, as I've suggested. So you can take all of your interview transcripts, or you can take all of the responses from the Why Remember data, for example, which were all in Excel spreadsheets, and you can look for keywords, or you can put them into a system that will allow you to kind of track how people are using language across the entirety of the data set, and that tells you something about the data set, but it's often quite kind of remote. It's pulling keywords out, and you don't really know how people are using those, key terms. So you've got to get into it in a bit more detail. So often what we will do if we've got a very large data set is take a kind of subset of that data and explore that in kind of richer, more qualitative terms. And if we're working with interview data or focus group data, we would again kind of explore that in more qualitative ways. So doing things like thematic analysis, so looking for kind of key themes that emerge throughout the data. And there you're just kind of sitting with the data really, which is really nice to do. And in my case, me and my highlighters, all very analog, going through and kind of color coding things that people have said to begin to pull out the kind of key strands and themes, and then that allows you then to kind of talk across the data in ways that are more meaningful. And to kind of pull, bits of data together. So you can say, well, this group of people felt like this about this experience, but this group of people felt, in this felt like this. And you can pull at the kind of language that they've used as well, which is something that we've done in the work that the research work that we've done around the experiences that we've worked on, really exploring what people have to say and what kinds of, lexical choices they use, what words are they using to describe these experiences, do they, volunteer, do they start talking about immersion before we even bring that into the conversation? Is that a term that kind of, occurs naturally to them as they're starting to talk about an experience? Or maybe they talk about something as being emotional, so we're not going and saying to them, did you find that emotional? But starting to see whether those things may emerge from the data. That's quite a kind of grounded approach to using the data, seeing what it suggests, what it tells us about what was important or significant in terms of an experience.